Ladies and gentlemen, Jörg Chrestman.
All right, let's hear for Jared. All right. So, Jared, Jared, he has a lot of people back there in the back at the Through the Black channel people. So they guys came in a crowd. They came in a group. So, Jared, for those people that don't know, a little bit of echo. For those people that don't know what Through the Black is, go ahead and tell us what Through the Black is.
I don't even really know what Through the Black is yet. We've been trying to figure that out for 2 years. It's really just a brainchild of my buddy Tom Dunn and I that needed to create something therapeutic to kind of offset some of the darkness we find ourselves in the midst of on a regular basis. We primarily deal with people on the issue of satanic ritual abuse, areas of spiritual warfare as pertains to a biblical Christian worldview. So we kind of became a lightning rod for people in the area of deliverance, and so we just end up in some of the craziest situations, making some of the weirdest documentaries and doing some of the strangest interviews. So,
right on. So I first became aware of Jared due to Matt Long. Matt Long hosted this really cool round table,
Yeah.
And there was, you were there, and I didn't even know who you were, but Rob was there. I'm like, okay, I'm meeting these guys for the first time over the internet. But the thing that you said that really blew my mind was when you meet people and they've been in the occult and and you're bringing them out of the satanic ritual abuse, they have this anger about them. And you said that you experienced that with people that that believe in the globe when you start opening their eyes about the flat earth. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, they're just, anytime you challenge somebody's programming, there's usually an anger response. And that's something that's been interesting to me for a long time. You see, without going too much into it, you have people that can be programmed, and when I say programmed, I don't mean in some sort of Manchurian candidate sophisticated way, but you have people that have an indoctrination and a preconceived notions, presuppositions, a set of beliefs that they may not be able to defend, but they know to be true simply because of their own experience, right? So you can have people that grow up in generational Satanism that learn something very specific, that through various rituals or something, maybe somebody will dress up like Jesus and abuse them at a young age. Maybe they'll tell them, I know I'm throwing out a lot here, we're going quick, but there are rituals where you have people that will abuse children or young teenagers. They'll dress up like Jesus, they'll do the abuse. They'll tell that child to call on the devil, to call on Satan, to call on the demonic for help. Someone will come in dressed as something stereotypically related to that. They'll beat the Jesus up, they'll free the kid, take the bonds off. What I'm saying is that kid walks away with this idea that it is Lucifer himself, Satan, the devil, whatever, that was the liberator and provided freedom there. So when that child grows up inside of generational Satanism, you have somebody that will automatically rebuke somebody that says Jesus loves you. They know that that's not true. You would see an anger response, right, because of the experiences that they've had. I've noticed that. That's a crazy example when we're talking about flat earth, but having dealt with people on that level, when I would just ask the question, how do you know the earth is a globe, I saw the same kind of challenge to programming, because you would see an immediate angry response, one that wasn't rooted in reason or logic or thought or questioning. It was immediate anger. And that told me, we're not dealing with facts right now, we're dealing with your emotions, because I just challenged your preconceived notions with a question.
Fantastic. Yeah, that blew my mind when I heard that. So just switching gears real quick, when we had some changes in the schedule, and one of the first people that I thought about is like, I've got to ask Jared to talk about, who is NASA really? And you guys are in for a treat on this talk, man. I'm so excited to be here to hear this. So ladies and gentlemen, Jared Chrestman.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy to be here, Joe. Thank you for inviting me. I still, at events like this, when I'm hanging out with a bunch of weirdos just like myself, I know I'm in good company, but when I'm in California at 7:55, it's almost 10 o'clock my time in Texas. I just wonder, man, how did I get here? How did I get here? How did we get to the point where we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about? There's no way that it's possible for me to tackle this subject in the time allotted. The only reason I'm talking about this subject is by accident, simply because of some of the other things that I've been involved with over the years, which I'm not here to talk about. I had to explore some of the occultic background as it pertained to Nazis, simply because there's still remnants of what we refer to as the Fourth Reich, the Fifth Reich, fifth generation, generational Satanists, things like that. We still see a lot of Nazi elements sometimes in some of these families that carry over from, a Nazi lineage, a bloodline. You'll find that within the Nazi party, bloodline was a big deal, mainly because of a lot of their occultic and pagan belief systems. I had to study this stuff, and I started, because I've always really been interested in conspiracies, even from a boy. I was the 9-year-old kid that was using his mowing money to buy the National Enquirer because somebody saw Bat Boy in New Jersey. That was me. I absolutely love that growing up. I've always been very interested in conspiracies. Some of the nature of my own testimony and background as a kid, I've been very open to a lot of things that simply a lot of people aren't open to. Over the years, that's turned into a lot of research, a lot of weirdness, and a lot of interesting experiences. But nevertheless, in this case, as I started exploring, long before I started exploring the idea of flat Earth and alternative cosmology, I already had a basic understanding of where NASA had come from. I distrusted NASA because I understood some of the parties that were involved in their inception. And I understood a little more about the belief system in the world that they came from. And I really had a problem with the idea of planets. I didn't come to flat Earth the way most people came to flat Earth. I came to flat Earth by way of doing a biblical study on planets because I distrusted NASA's space program. It was very hard for me to rectify these two things because at the time, flat Earth was not really a huge thing. There were no YouTube videos that people could explore. In fact, at the time, there was really only one video that was even questioning the nature of planets, and it was coming from black Hebrew Israelites that had a lot of things twisted, but were asking interesting questions on this particular subject that I'm talking about. And that 15-minute video kind of rocked my world because I was like, they're making a fantastic point. I distrust NASA. I know who they are. They've not given me anything that's solid as far as what I'm able to look at in doing research on planets. The scripture, when I did a study on the word planets as it was translated in Hebrews, it didn't mean anything related to worlds. And I just really was trying to fit the modern paradigm into the creation account in Genesis, just looking for answers, not really knowing what I was looking for. Something was wrong. And eventually, it just led me deeper into this subject, and we're going to go through it kind of fast. Now, my hope with this is I created this as a fun project, okay? I gave it once. Chad, I think you were in the front row the last time I gave it, and it'll probably just be as wild and fast as it was last time. But my hope in this is not everybody walks away and says, oh my gosh, I understand this now. There are going to be a lot of crazy things that I'm fixing to say. In fact, if I didn't have this coffee table book that I made, I wouldn't be able to remember half of it because it's that crazy. What I want to do is, at least in the time allotted, just create an understanding that there's a lot more to this subject than most people realize, okay? And this presentation is much more on the background of who the Nazis were as a people, and not so much as NASA, but I'll let you fill in the dots once you know that NASA was primarily started with a large group of Nazis. You had Masons, you had magicians. You can understand at least a portion of the background that NASA has. And this in and of itself, with what we're fixing to talk about, should at least provide you another place to explore and do some research and at least ask questions. Why do I have to trust NASA? And I don't think we have to. This is just at least a part of the story as to why I have questions. So one of the things, let's see. Yeah, Nazis, the occult, and their bizarre cosmology. I actually have added more to this presentation since I gave it. I kind of refreshed my memory last minute, but there are three great books that I recommend if people are interested in this subject that they can go and read. Nazis and the Occult. It's a book by Dusty Sklar. I've always found that one interesting. Game of Gods by Carl Tykrib has a lot of interesting things on the buildup and their own political system and their background that's very interesting in relationship to the Nazis. And another book is The Nazis and the Occult, Dark Forces Unleashed by the Third Reich by Paul Rowland. That's a fantastic book if you guys are interested in looking at the sources that I've used to make this presentation. I'm going to have to talk fast, so I need water. Something that's always fascinated me is these theories for how Adolf Hitler came to power. As a kid, I watched endless hours of World War II documentaries on the History Channel against my will, but mainly because it was something my father he loved watching the World War II stuff on the History Channel. I can remember everything that I ever watched on the History Channel focused on the battles, the war. Adolf, really nothing in specific about who these people were. It always focused on the war. And primarily, I really never heard a good reason or any sort of response to how Adolf Hitler was capable of producing such massive atrocities. You know, we heard that he did, and they talked about the facts, but I can remember in all the time that I spent watching those documentaries, nothing really gave us a proper response to the why or the how, right? What was happening in this man's mind that led up to this? It's pretty much just led most people to conclude that it was just a particularly bad breed of person there, and that one bad apple spoiled the bunch. I have come to find out and believe that that is not the case. I believe that the answer to why Hitler ultimately did what he did was because of the occult. So much popular interest around Nazi Germany is centered and focused on World War II. Far less attention is given to the domestic spiritual milieu of the National Socialist state. Of importance is the development of myth and meaning as put forward by party leadership and by those intellectuals who fashioned the underlying context. It's a quote from Karl Teichgrib. The Nazi worldview was largely based in mythological belief systems and alternative history such as the giants, Hollow Earth, cosmic ice theory, magic, Vril, Aryan supermen, and their advanced spiritual technology. Pagan deities such as Odin, Wotan, they were heavily influenced by the medieval fantasies and Eastern mysticism as well as Oriental forms of Freemasonry. We're going to elaborate on some of these, but I'm going to lay some of this out quickly first. When given a choice, here we go. When given a choice, German leadership seemed to always sacrifice reason and logic at the altar of superstition and mystical ideology. They set out to create a new chosen race, essentially replacing the people of God. They believed this new race would be endowed with supernatural gifts and would be free from the burdens of guilt and conscience. They indulged their demonic desires to wage war on the moral character of God and to liberate the new chosen race from the shackles of moral slavery by way of a new Messiah, the almighty and magnificent Führer. Essentially, they were creating a race of blind, obedient servants. And this is something that you will always see used as a form of manipulation that works contrary to thought and reason. Conspiracy, if I'm not on the right slide because I lose one, tell me I'm not on the right slide. I like to interact with people and you can yell at me. Yeah, it's whatever. Oh, there's one. Thank you. I didn't even notice there was a freaking TV there. Conspiracy theories that insinuate that the Jews were responsible for the world's evil and that Hitler was only combating a hidden Zionist agenda, I think missed the bigger picture. I am well aware of a lot of the Zionist conspiracies, a lot of the issues that we have with modern day Israel, a lot of issues and problems people have with the modern evangelical church and supporting Israel. I understand all of this. I am not speaking to anti-Semitism tonight, and I'm not speaking to some of the larger problems that we could hash out. I don't know that I have a valid or a concrete opinion on what's really happening. But I can tell you that without a doubt, I believe that Hitler sought to eradicate the perceived threat of the Jews only so he could elevate the German people to a fascist dictatorship, bringing a new order and a new religion. And I ultimately believe that at the end of the day, with all these conspiracy theories that are out there, I believe that World War II was summed up as a war between secret societies. And I firmly believe that. They did not trust the cosmological paradigm of the early 20th century and firmly believed that out of the West, the Jew was directing the flow of scientific thought about the nature of reality, purposefully steering the world away from the truth. And we'll talk more about that. They believed that almost every scientific hypothesis that came out of the West was part of a larger Jesuit conspiracy to mislead the world. They absolutely trusted nothing that came out of the West. The foundational worldview that led up to the formation of the Nazi Party and subsequent horror show that followed were still held by many that played pivotal roles in the formation of NASA. The Third Reich transitioned into the Fourth Reich and is still alive and well in the world today. And if you ever want evidence on that, you can just look at the study in history of corporations and how a lot of these corporations were largely created or infiltrated or funded after Operation Paperclip. There's a huge presence of Nazis after World War II, primarily because we invited them in and gave them a foothold. Now, a lot of this is really important. We're not going into depth on it, but I want you guys to be aware that this exists, because if nothing else, I'd like for you to research it on your own. We're going to talk about the foundations of the Nazi worldview and the birth of Völkisch. How many of you have ever heard the word Völkisch? Awesome, just a few. I hadn't, and I had no idea. Come to find out, there's not a real English word for it, right? So let's start with a brief history lesson before we get into Völkisch. Anti-Semitism ran deep in German culture long before the creation of the Nazi Party. It seems like a lot of people I talk to think that anti-Semitism was a result of Hitler's mindset in Germany at the time of World War II. That was not the case. Anti-Semitism was a byproduct of Germans coming into the Romantic era, the period of the 1800s to the 1850s. 100 years before the German Jew emancipation, they were locked behind ghetto walls with special curfews, taxes, restricted marital rights, limiting an age of a Jew for marriage to 25 or older. They were very much oppressed long before the 1900s. This was not something that was new. It was not something new at the time of it happening. In the early 1800s, Germans had plenty of their own problems and issues with poverty. Historical accounts describe a spirit of disappointment and desperation hanging above the German people like a cloud. For a while, German philosophers began looking to the Eastern philosophy as a romantic escape, presenting a golden age long hoped for. What you see with the history of Germany is you actually see desperation breeding fantasy. You had a form of escapism that was created because things were dark. Things were really, really bad and very depressing. Fantasy provides hope oftentimes. I think it's one of the reasons why this is a topic in and of itself, but I just find it so interesting today that we are so obsessed and consumed with entertainment at a time in our lives where most people seem to be wandering without purpose, right? This is something that Germany was lacking, was a sense of purpose, a sense of identity. And fantasy and the Eastern mysticism that they ended up adopting provided them this, and it gave them sort of a national brotherhood. They actually turned to the occult for the hope that they desired. Let me tell you right now, spoiler alert, turning to the occult for hope is never a good thing, okay? We already know this. I don't have to spoiler alert on what happened to them. You guys already know. Carl Teichrieb actually talks about this time period in his book, Game of Gods. Fantastic book. I haven't read it all, but I've read over half of it. Highly recommend it. He talks about this time period as a time when men had experienced the inner revolution of Romanticism, new religious movements, and an upsurge in esoteric interests. It was a time when postmodernism and the New Age began to walk hand in hand. You'll find that secularism is often a bridge between two religious points of view. It's interesting that in our own time period, postmodernism paved the way to destroying objective truth. Secularism moved in its place. We're in the middle of actually seeing the New Age walk hand in hand with postmodernism. It's always something that ushers in sort of a new religious movement. And we share a lot of similarities with Nazi Germany today, in some respects. Not their National Socialism, it's not leading necessarily to the same conclusions, but nevertheless, spiritually, there are a lot of similarities. You guys can connect the dots as we continue. Friedrich Schlegel, a German poet, somewhere around 1800, he actually said it is to the East that we must look for the supreme romanticism. I don't know how many of you guys know much about romanticism. I know I do not know that much, but I do know that between the 1800s and the 1850s, it stressed to the people that followed the movement that feelings and emotions were just as equal as far as aesthetic experience to other forms of beauty. So if I could look at flowers and beautiful colors and write poetry and observe things that had aesthetic beauty to them, they considered fabricated emotional experiences to be on the same level with experiencing other aesthetic forms of beauty. So you had a massive explosion in things like literature where we had horror writing for the first time. It was an idea that we can go ahead and evoke emotion. We had passionate sonnets, we had operas. Everything we did appealed to the feelings of a person and not necessarily reason or logic. We considered it to be a supreme experience to navigating life and experiencing it. We appealed to emotion rather than thought. It prized and glorified intense emotion. Oh wait, no, I'm good. It prized and glorified intense emotion as another form of experience equal to aesthetic experience. This is where horror writings came from, where we emphasized emotion as well as anything else that evoked those kinds of feelings. This is our first hint, the direction Germany was taking as far as its mindset was concerned. They began to feel their way through discerning reality, right? And we all know people that do this. This is something that the human condition is prone to do, okay? But as a people, as a collective people searching for an identity, this is not good. Let's see. I've got so many notes on this page that I'm going to not read everything, but let me just say this. I'll say that anytime a people, even if it's unwitting and not something intended, if they begin to endorse feelings over reason and logic, the ability to think rightly is greatly compromised. It's actually, I'm doing a lot of work like, you know, as a Christian, I'm doing a lot of work like this right now, especially when it comes to the charismatic movement, because I see a lot of similarities here as well. Primarily working with texts from Puritans like Jonathan Edwards. The spiritual journey to the East, undertaken by many German scholars, philosophers, and men of letters, brought a new mythology to a politically, economically, and socially despairing country, a mystical view that all finitude is the result of a fall from the absolute and that the effects of the fall have to be repaired by the course of history. These writers began to glorify the Middle Ages as a period of dialogue with God, when men, art, and religion had been unified to restore the lost innocence became their aim. You'll see that this medieval time period that became romanticized, these things that they appealed to in their own German heritage, this was actually a very dark time in history spiritually. This was a time when things were not good. Things were not good at all. It was very depressing. It was very dark. You had a lot of... You really didn't have a lot of fruit, especially in the Christian world. You kind of had a lot of backtracking. It's kind of where a lot of the chanting monks and stuff came out of, because nobody was really having authentic spiritual experiences. They were trying to generate spiritual experiences by creating new methods by which to experience God. You know, you had, if we chant properly and go through these exercises, maybe we can find God out there somewhere. That kind of became a prevailing theme in some of the religious thought at that time. It was very dark. It was very dark. Influential segments of German population, and this isn't a slide, these are just my notes that I wrote. Influential segments of German population deepened their exploration in a wide range of pagan expressions, including Nordic mythology, folklorism, theosophy, and Aryan occult doctrine. German theorists, let me do that. There's a guy named Alfred Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg was he was just a German theorist. I'm not even really completely sure. I've never done a lot of research on him. I'm not completely sure who he was exactly. But he wrote this Aryan-themed story that weaved the themes of Hindu oneness, Nordic deities, anti-Semitic overtones, and an argument for the reconfiguration of Christianity. This is something that evoked a personal commendation from Hitler, and he was actually awarded the National Prize for it. If you heard what I said, what that story was about, and the fact that leadership within Germany awarded him the National Prize, you can see where their mindset was by, I would guess, sympathizing with it to the extent that they also believed everything that he had put in that story. Racial purity among the ruling class was a primary component of ancient Hindu doctrine, and within a short period, having been adopted by the Germans, they began to rationalize and espouse German superiority over the Jew. This was only exacerbated by the theories of the early 1800s that the Aryan forebears of India and ancient Germans shared the same mystical symbols and gods. I understand that what I'm saying right now is not necessarily making a whole lot of sense in the context of history, because there's so much here that we're leaving out. But understand this. Everything that I just said led to something called the birth of Völkisch. Between 1857 and 1910, the Jewish population in Vienna increased by over 400%. And they prospered. They absolutely prospered. There was a time period here where while they were being oppressed, they began to prosper significantly, and it began to disturb the German population. They began to grow very concerned that the Jews were prospering more than they were in the areas of business and in social influences, and even though they were oppressed, they were doing quite well for themselves. Germans began to see this as a problem. The term Völkisch means of the people. There's no English word for it. It was a movement combining folklore, occultism, and ethnic nationalism, later adopted by the Nazis, and it appealed to dreamers, not to thinkers, and not to scholars. Völkisch essentially is a cult of race. This is where we really start to see this eugenics mindset move in with the entire people of Germany. And when we say Aryan, I'm not talking about just white men. There was a concept in their pagan mythology that the Aryan was the supernatural white man that they were related to, that came, long before in some of their Teutonic folklore and stuff. Propaganda was developed against all foreign elements. These concepts of Reich and Volk were developed, while simultaneously anti-Semitic nationalistic cults began to spring up in secret throughout Germany. As the Nazi Party was being created, you'll find that there were over 100 things called, it was over 100 lodges that were a part of something called the German Order, which was a secret fraternal organization that was absolutely sold on everything we're talking about. There were a lot of people that supported this, mostly aristocratic in nature. It was mostly elitist, but they were the ones controlling and influencing politics. Volk in its purest form is the authentic and pure community. It's an ethnic spiritual identity in which the individual is consumed with the German ideal. The best of them found refuge from the despair of their daily life in a perverse fanaticism called the mysticism of a political movement. In almost no other country were so many miracles performed, so many ghosts conjured, so many illnesses cured by magnetism, raw animal magnetism in the occultic sense, so many horoscopes read between the two world wars, a veritable mania of superstition had seized the country, and all those who made a living exploiting stupidity thought the millennium had come. Many were convinced that the course of history was the sinister result of the ministrations of ancient secret societies. As such, they considered not only the modern Freemasons, but also the Jews and Jesuits. This is where things really start to take a turn. That was from Conrad Hayden, the memoirs of Dr. Felix Kirstein. Everybody was into this. The guy I just quoted was Himmler's personal masseuse. This is, how many of your masseuses talking? How many times are you getting a massage and you get some sort of philosophical worldview on ethnic identity? It just, it consumed the people. Even Carl Jung noted at that time that he believed Hitler was able to address the Teutonic archetypes who symbolized the primal forces in the German psyche. Wotan, Odin, Thor, the lords of chaos. Jung actually suggested that the gods were revitalized by contact with Hitler and erupted from the collective unconscious to lead the nation to war. Man, I hope you guys understand what I'm saying, because this is, I'm fixing to jump into a lot of people that you haven't heard of before, and we're going to talk about their backgrounds, and it just gets crazier. This is crazy to me. The people's symbolic gestures were actually used ritualistically. You see these things where, the Heil Hitler, you'll find that when you start looking at the stuff, there was actually a form of ritualistic magic. There are a lot of people that argue as to exactly what it symbolized, but ritual in the context of pagan mythology and Eastern mysticism, I think in Carl Teichgrube's book, Game of Gods, I think he had one of the most accurate definitions of it. From the perspective of myth, the three realms, nature, humanity, and deity, operate within a shared reality in which all are mystically bound and interrelated. When this worldview is enacted via ritual, the practitioner is embarking on a transpersonal journey meant to shift one's sense of time and space, to induce an altered state of mind, and to magically interact with cosmic cycles. Ritual, which can be related to but different from ceremony, is a sacred drama in which you are the audience as well as the participant. It allows one to identify with the thing, not just sit back and analyze it. This is exactly what happened. You had the Nazis that started using the people as a form of ritual to help guide their minds into a place where they were focused on what they were doing in their own magical mindset. Events and situations require explanation. Explanations universalized, generalized, and given flesh become myths. Myths shape perception. Perception produces policies. Policies cause events and situations. And to begin again at the beginning, events and situations require explanation. How can one separate the beginning of the circle from the end, the mythic invention from the archetypal situation, or the fabrication from the candid recognition of a geopolitical fact? They share a self-perpetuating cycle. The first feeds the last, and the last vindicates, reinstates the first. It does not matter if this mindset or anything I've said makes sense. What matters is that the German people, and primarily the aristocratic leadership, they believed every ounce of this with 100% of their being. Everything that we just talked about, ethnic identity, the anti-Semitism for this bestial class of people they called the Jews. They're looking to the romantic nature of Eastern mysticism. All of this led to policy. All of this led to official government protocol, decisions. They acted on it. They believed it. There's a guy, George Lanz von Liebenfels. Lanz was the creator of the Order of the New Templars in 1900 and author of the racially charged magazine Ostera. This was a massive influence on a very young Hitler around 1909. You got to understand the mindset at this time, as we've already briefly mentioned. You had a massive amount of anti-Semitic propaganda that started hitting the newsstands. Imagine going to CVS or a Walgreens or a Walmart or wherever you see magazine stands and seeing entire magazines completely dedicated to the destruction of a single people group. Even at the height of the civil rights movement in the United States, we didn't have anything that crazy. I mean, you had maybe KKK literature, in the 60s, but even before that, even when we were full-blown slave state, you really didn't have that sort of mindset that breeded such a sense of purpose in eradicating an entire people. They were unashamed of it. It simply was a way of life. This was a fact. It must be carried out. And it gave the German people a sense of brotherhood. So much so, they referred to them as bestial peoples. The order used the swastika symbol, advocated master race ideals, and developed rituals from appropriation of the Holy Grail traditions in Parsifal, a figure of Arthurian legend also known as Sir Parsifal, who is in turn a later form of a hero of Celtic myth. Lanz believed that the Aryans worshipped the god Fraha Christus, which was a Gothic name for Jesus, who demanded the sacrificial slaughter of the subhumans to purify the world. Now, that's an interesting take on Jesus, right? Who's heard of Richard Wagner? Who likes classical music? I like classical music. I like Wagner. I had no idea until I started doing this with what we do on Through the Black, I get questions all the time. What happens if I listen to Led Zeppelin? Could I get possessed? I know they were really heavily into Satanism. What happens if I listen to heavy metal music? Can I get possessed? People focus on things that are very easy, low-hanging fruit, right? Anything that might look demonic or look dark, people like to attack, people get real weird and legalistic about. And whereas there can be some real dangers there, depending on what's happening with that person, what's interesting to me is in my research, I found that the most occultic things in our society are the ones that nobody notices. Or nobody cares about, right? You'll find that the history of classical music puts the 1970s to shame as far as music. Half the stuff we listen to from Beethoven was created for Masonic ceremonies. One of the most popular songs by Beethoven was actually designed for his father's initiation ritual into Freemasonry. And yet we play it as if it's something, it's beautiful. Who picks up on any of these demonic overtones? It's just music, okay? It's just music. I'm not that guy. I'm not super sensational. But let me tell you something. When you take something and you use it specifically to identify with the demonic, it doesn't matter what you're doing. I could create a Kundalini cooking class and get New Age in a kitchen. Now we have a problem. That doesn't make cooking off limits. But if I use it ritualistically to experience some form of counterfeit spirituality, well, now we have a problem, right? Music is no different. Classical music is beautiful. If I use it in an inappropriate manner to interact with the spiritual world, we have a huge issue because I'm now willingly inviting them into my life. That's what happened, okay? They started using these things in a manner that was completely inappropriate. Most people don't know the history of that. Wagner carried all of the themes that we're talking about in his operas. We had Supermen, we had Nephilim, we had these really crazy themes in all of his operas. Hitler actually spent his money going to Wagner operas like a normal kid would use his money going to a comic book store or an arcade. Well, I'm a 90s kid, we still had arcades. That's what he did. Wagner was preaching a message in his music, and Hitler was hooked, line, and sinker. Swastika. a lot of people, let's just shorten this up. Nobody really knows exactly where it came from. People argue all the time. Some people believe it was a symbol for the sun in the Nazi Party. Others believe it was just a 3,000-year-old symbol for joy. You know, it was a sort of a health and wealth symbol. But I can tell you this, I can tell you what the Nazis believed it was after they twisted it, spun it around the other way. I really do believe to them it represented the sun. You'll find that sun worship was a big thing within Nazi culture, which is interesting considering everything else that we look at as far as NASA and flat earth and heliocentrism, right? Start connecting the dots on your own. But the Nazis that really were into sun worship actually regarded a form of superiority. If to them, it would be like me saying this: if I like the sun more than you and put more value in the sun more than you, I am therefore superior to you. The amount of reverence and awe one had for the sun directly corresponded in their mind to the value and worth they placed on that person. That was absolutely something documented over and over and over again in obscure Nazi literature. At the end of the day, the Nazis, I believe, reversed the direction of the swastika spin because they believed it symbolized the descending of Thor's hammer. It was a symbol of destruction. There was actually a von List, a guy we'll talk about here in a second, he actually believed it represented the fire whisk. There's a concept we'll get into, cosmic ice and fire with their own cosmology, but he actually believes, like we talk about with it being the sun, that it represented something even more primordial, the inception of the universe, that a fire whisk, cosmic fire. I still don't completely understand what they believed. It was really weird. How am I doing on time? I didn't look at my watch when I got up here. Does anybody know? Joe? How much time do I have so I can figure this out?
25 minutes.
Okay, we'll skip some stuff. One shall remember that the swastika and fascist movements are basically offspring of Ostara. It became official in 1927. Okay, we're going to get into this guy, von List, or Lanz. We're still in Lanz Liebenfels. Guys, the words that are fixing to come out of my mouth are absolutely ridiculous, okay? And it honestly sounds like I'm the dungeon master in a Dungeons and Dragons round or something as I start to read the rest of this stuff, so bear with me. I understand it's ridiculous, but these are things that these people wrote, and if you just casually look at this, you'll understand where I'm coming from at the nature of their mindset. Lanz actually wrote a book called Theozoology, or the Lore of the Sodom Apelings and the Electron of the Gods. He was a defrocked Cistercian monk. He believed that ancient Aryan heroes possessed organs with electromagnetic radiological properties which gave them the ability to harness energy for special powers. He believed that by establishing special breeding colonies they could reclaim those lost physical traits mentioned above. Let me read you some of the things. I actually verified. I pulled this off of Wikipedia just because it was easy, but I've gone through some of this actual book. This Wikipedia entry is legitimate. He wrote Theozoology in 1905, in which he advocated sterilization of the sick and the lower races, as well as forced labor for castrated chandals, and glorified the Aryan race as godmen. Lanz justified his esoteric racial ideology by attempting to give it a biblical foundation. According to him, Eve, who he described as initially being divine, involved herself with a demon and gave birth to the lower races in the process. Furthermore, he claimed that this led to blonde women being attracted primarily to dark men, something that only could be stopped by racial demixing, so that the Aryan Christian master humans could once again rule the dark-skinned beast men and ultimately achieve divinity. A copy of the book was sent to Swedish poet August Strindberg, from whom Lanz received an enthusiastic reply in which he was described as a prophetic voice. Just take that in for a second. I honestly feel like you have to take this stuff in chunks. I took this in over a year. You guys are taking it in like 50 minutes, so God bless you. List was the founder of the Ahnenerbe Society in 1908. The Ahnenerbe were the theorized priest kings of the ancient Aryan race, the priests of Wotan, of which he believed himself to be the last. This was a combination, it's called Armenschaft. It was a combination of Ariosophy and Arminianism, not to be confused with Arminianism if you have some theologically inclined people here. It was Arminianism. Arminianism was List's doctrine that was derived from the Arminian stuff. Ariosophy is the spiritual wisdom of the Aryan race. It was believed that the Knights Templar were the guardians of this before the Christian church suppressed them in 1308. Many believe that List was actually responsible for the anti-Christian sentiments that Germany actually adopted. He's one of the earliest supporters of this and was very influential on that subject. He died in 1919 before the Nazi Party actually was officially solidified. List was really born at a time when anybody who claimed to have channeled arcane wisdom of the ancients or read anything, that pertained to secrets of life and death in the Akashic records, it was all accepted. He was born in a time period where if you said, "I had a vision," or "the God spoke to me," it was immediately accepted. Nobody questioned it. I mean, we were at a sensational point in our mindset in Germany at that time that nobody asked really any questions. It was just, however you're feeling, let's just jump on board. Let me tell you a little bit about this boy's youth and see if you had a similar experience as a child. And if you haven't, well, then you're just like a normal child and you can put yourself in a position where you understand how weird this was. At the age of 14, the young List vowed to build a temple to Wotan, another name for Odin, tying into the Norse theme, while praying at an altar in the catacombs of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. He was a member of the Austrian Alp Society, which was an early adopter of the Howl, the hill symbol, and it was very pagan in its roots. He was primarily responsible for reviving Teutonic folklore and its mythology. He really believed that the ancient Armenian Brotherhood that we just mentioned had left these philological clues, this philology, the study of language and its roots. He believed that in the names of the hills and the streams and the places around there that these Armenian brothers had left clues about specific things pertaining to their secrets and evidence that they had left behind. But in reality, when you look at his work, he just read into names and places where he wanted to find stuff and ignored sites that didn't confirm any of his theories. He was all over the place, completely inconsistent, and he would just read his preconceived notions, creating evidence. He wasn't really a good researcher. The Armenian Orden itself, this was the last, he considered himself to be the last of the Armenian priest kings. So, being one that subscribed to Hindu oneness, reincarnation was a very big deal amongst the German people. A lot of them would, in the aristocracy, believe that they actually came from a lot of the mythological, heroic forebears that had died long ago. They would actually attribute to themselves titles, and they would, create these own historical narratives for their past lives that just quite simply had no basis in fact. But nevertheless, he believed that he was the last of the Armenian priests. He passed on the ancient wisdom he was able to divine through intuition and clairvoyance. Sacred knowledge was hidden in words and signs, and he used this knowledge to widen support by reviving pagan worship. It was well received and boasted membership of some very wealthy backers, and he ended up writing something called Secret of the Runes. Wotan was said to be the inventor of an ancient alphabet, right? Runes. How many of you know what a rune is, right? These crazy weird symbols that you would see. Witches today still put them on rocks and stuff for rituals, and you see them all over the place. They would put it on their flags, use it in their marches. You would actually see, runes that were actually used. The SS marks, those were runes essentially. They were the Sig Sol rune. It was representative of the sun. Wotan received these by hanging on a tree for 9 days, starving and thirsting, while performing a shamanic ritual. It was believed to be a powerful secret lore of which later runes became a tool. Look at some of these runes. You see what I'm talking about here? If you guys ever look at SS pictures, they were usually sideways. But right here, this is what we would see cockeyed a little bit. They would run at an angle or completely flat. But this was the rune that they would put on their uniforms. They were completely sold out to this idea. It was in everything that they did. And if you look back at some of the ceremonies and the pictures of processions and stuff they had in the form of parades, you'll find that runes, they were everywhere. They put a lot of stock into this. List believed that these runes that I have listed here were actually revealed to him during that mystical experience that he had of Odin simply creating this language, and that he actually wrote a song called the Song of 18 Runes where he enumerated Odin's 18 wisdoms. No one has ever proven whether or not Hitler actually became a member of the Order of the New Templars or the Ahnenerbe, but history is certain that he was an avid reader of Astara and had met with Lanz several times in person, attesting in his book, Mein Kampf, to this period of time as a period providing him with a foundation, the foundations of knowledge. So everything I just talked about, Odin, Wotan, shamanic rituals, ruins, this guy that was a defrocked Cistercian monk that pledged to serve Wotan at the age of 14 in a Catholic cathedral was one of the most influential figures in Hitler's life as a youth. Think about that. Hitler considered this to be the foundations for a knowledge. There's a lot more to this than we ever have time to go into, but it only gets weirder. I'm going to skip forward just a little bit because I actually want to get into some other stuff. I want to get into cosmic ice. We're not even talking about Rudolf, Rudolf von Sabbatendorf. We're not talking about the Thule Society and everything that went with Thule and the Ahnenerbe and these secret societies that were used. Let's just jump to Hitler a little bit. Let me jump forward. Sabbatendorf was crazy. You guys can go read about him on your own. Yeah, we'll jump here. The Thule Society was actually the name of the ancient Aryan homeland. It was an island in the far north, still preserving the ancient knowledge and guarded by ancient super beings akin to ascended masters of theosophy. It became the political strong arm of the German Orden and helped prepare for a counter-revolution against the government so that the long prophesied Führer could be firmly established in leadership. They primarily studied occult meaning and symbolism inside the German alphabet. They were fierce anti-Semites, and they preached the coming of a Führer who would erase their current form of democracy. They collected weapons for revolution, bought a newspaper, instigated terrorist activity, and created frenzied racial propaganda against the Jews. They believed that the Aryan race itself was taller. They believed it was stronger. They believed they had special supernatural abilities. They believed that this Aryan race had the ability to commune with these gods that came long before, that later on in Theosophy were referred to as the Ascended Masters by Helena P. Blavatsky. They believed that the Easter Island statues represented the actual size of ancient Aryan supermen, and they believed they were the descendants of the Nephilim. Okay, how many of you ever heard the word Nephilim? Yeah, you guys, okay, we're living in 2019. I'm glad to see that. Not that many hands used to go up. I love it. That's essentially what these guys were. I mean, they're taller, stronger, supernatural. What does that sound like to you? It's Nephilim. They would even use the word Nephilim in some of the writings. They believe, it's essentially what eugenics ended up becoming. You'll find that eugenics, not the Margaret Sanger 1930s eugenics, but their form of eugenics, was about weeding out genetic inferiority so that they could backwards engineer their way to the original Nephilim bloodlines. It was a scientific way of becoming superhuman, right? That was the whole point. Hitler had, this is weird. Before I get into the Verlainen Society. They believed that the earth was hollow and inhabited by a race of super beings. The ancient Aryans were said to have descended from this race of super beings. Once initiated into Thule, and this is where it gets weird, you were supposedly able to contact higher masters through magical rituals. The masters would endow the initiates with special abilities. You'll actually find that within the SS, Himmler's SS, in Wedelsburg Castle, in the crypt, also known as the Temple of the Black Sun, you would have a collection of SS soldiers. Sometimes, according to some of the documents that were in the, it's late and I just lost it. What was the Nuremberg trials? I have not been able to vet this, but it absolutely would not surprise me, that every now and then you would have a willing SS participant that would allow himself to be decapitated. His head would be presented on a platter at a round table, right? Because we're thinking Knights of, the Templar, right? We have to get medieval and romantic about it. You would have your Knights of the Round Table inside the Temple of the Black Sun, and they would use the severed head of a willing participant, one that was worthy of it, right? Fellow SS trooper, and they would commune with these Aryan gods, these forebears. I mean, dude, this was, it wasn't my childhood. I hope it wasn't yours. The Thule Society itself had this special branch of female mediums known as Verlainen. Okay? Now, I learned this when I was studying ufology for a good period of time. I was trying to make connections between UFOs and Nephilim, and way back in the day. And I kept running into this because there's all this evidence of secret, technological projects within Nazi scientific communities where, the Nazi Bell Project and Foo Fighters and things like this. A lot of people ascribe the success of those programs to this woman channeling technology through mediumship, actually writing technological specs, through mediumship. That's essentially who this woman was. She was very influential. In fact, a lot of people consider her to be one of the most influential women in Hitler's circle. She was very much into the concept of vril, which was just a fictional energy source that was used by the subterranean master race in a book written by Edward Bulwer Lytton. It was called The Power of the... Well, it had two titles, but the one that I know it as was Vril, the Power of the Coming Race. She was both a leader of the Vril-Lenin, she was Hitler's personal medium, she was a centerpiece of Vril history, and through telepathic automatic writing, she literally created technological blueprints for all kinds of crazy technology. There was something really wild happening. The messages were presented to a small group of leaders representing the Thule Society, the Vril Society, and the Black Sun Society. Legend has it that through automatic writing, she wrote her transmissions in an ancient German secret Templar script and another in Sumerian. People have said this. I have not been able to find any shred of evidence that that is true. But once again, I have seen people write some crazy things under the influence of something otherworldly, and it would not surprise me. One of my earliest experiences in New Orleans, in the heart of voodoo country prior to Hurricane Katrina, was watching a woman that literally handed herself over to something. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head and she created some of the most amazing spray paint art. I remember watching this firsthand at the age of 13. I wanted to buy a piece because I didn't realize her eyes were rolled completely in the back of her head as she was making it. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. As a 13-year-old, I shouldn't have been on Jackson Square running around by myself, but I was. And luckily, street preachers were a dime a dozen out there because there was more activity than any one Christian could handle. And I'll never forget this weird evangelist street preacher that was really loud and really obnoxious, but he was standing next to me. And I remember as I pulled out my wallet to give this woman $13 for 2 of these spray painting prints, I remember he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, "Son, are you sure you want to buy that?" And I was like, "It looks amazing. Why wouldn't I?" And he said, "Did you look at her eyes?" And I got down because she's on the ground on all fours. I looked up at her eyes. They were rolled completely in the back of her head, solid white, and there was just some weird moan coming out of her mouth, like a moan whisper. And I got up and I said, "That's weird." And he's like, "She's not the one making the art." He said, "I would suggest you..." He was like, "I don't know, you can do what you want, but I wouldn't buy it." And I was very grateful for that at that moment. And I imagine that experience comes to mind often when I see this, because I've seen similar things to what's being described here with Maria Orsich. As beautiful as she is in this picture, I think something quite ugly was happening inside her, and I actually have more compassion for her at this point than I do, as far as wanting to make her a spectacle. Hitler wanted to control the occult. A lot of people make this case that Hitler tried to eradicate it. That case has been made. There's evidence for it, but let me tell you why he tried to eradicate it in Germany. I'm not giving you the backdrop or the history on this. You can do your own research. But very quickly, Hitler did try to purge the ability to engage in any occult form within the country. He tried to purge that and make that illegal. That does seem to be the case. But there are plenty of quotes, there's plenty of research. I'll just read you these 2. One of the reasons people fail to look at the occult as a motivating factor is, I lost my place, is due to the historical accounts of Hitler's painstaking attempts to eradicate occultism when he first came into power. People mistakenly assume this was because Hitler was opposed to irrational forms of faith. On the contrary, Hitler and the Nazi Party took it so seriously that they believed it posed a threat and they sought to control it. William Huff of Zodiac and the Swastika, he said, "For us, politics means the elimination of all forces except those serving the one constructive idea. In the Third Reich, we have to forbid astrology. We cannot permit any astrologers to follow their calling except those who are working for us. In the National Socialist state, astrology remains a privilege singularum. It's just Latin for singular privilege. It's not for the broad masses." I find this interesting. This is a quote that hit me hard. Here you have somebody that says, no, this is a valid thing to partake in, but we're not going to allow the people access to it unless they work for us because we want to control the narrative. If anybody in this country is good at the occult, then let it be done for the gain of our party. And they avidly went after people that sought knowledge or sought to practice it outside of what they could control. They wanted to control the language. They wanted to control the narrative. I find that interesting because I see that. I see that you guys can, you guys know a lot of stuff about NASA, but I see this idea of controlling the narrative a lot in the mainstream, not allowing people, why would they keep this from us? It's what they've always done. Who has not craved power? Knowledge is power, and to control, to create power, you control knowledge. Nathan Thompson, I think for the first time, he's talking about left-right brain stuff this morning. It's interesting. I've looked at a lot of other stuff about the brain except for that, but it's just more of the same. It's just keeping the mind of the people in some form of subservient position, not allowing them access. Charlotte Isabey, the deliberate dumbing down of America, creating kids that are just dumb to Common Core. We've completely bred reason and logic out of school. We don't even give them recess anymore half the time. It's not on accident. It's never on accident. We're trying to control the minds of people. Let's get into Hans Horberger real quick. This is called the Hans Horberger and his theory of eternal ice. This is where the cosmology comes into play. Joe, how am I doing on time?
18 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay. There's a lot about this story that is a little strange to me. It's very difficult to find accurate sources, but I think I have the basics in play. This is something that I ran into on accident about a year ago, with the flat Earth, the alternative cosmology thing in mind. Just another thing to make you think about what we're listening to. I'll tell you right up front, one of the things that interested me is that as intelligent as the Nazis were, as much money as they had, as much ability as they had, they were really quite an efficient people. The fact that they trusted nothing scientifically that came out of the West, and yet had a means and a desire and a motivation to study the things they were interested in, it does not seem that they were coming to any of the same conclusions that were coming out of the West. And they had a lot of ability and a lot of motivation to research it. None of the research was matching up. Now, I do not believe that their conclusions were valid. But one thing I do believe is that their conclusions indicate to me that they did not have the truth, and neither did the scientific community back in the early 1900s. And as you've guessed, I don't believe in the paradigm today either. Hans Horberger, I don't know how you pronounce it. He came to believe the moon was a floating ocean of ice, okay? As an engineer, he witnessed on one occasion an event where molten steel contacted snow and it violently erupted. The experience led to his ultimate cosmology and obsession with relationship between cosmic ice and fire. Let me put it to you this way. He was laying in the grass. He's a mechanical engineer. He's playing with molten steel every day. He's sitting in the grass or on a hill or something. There's snow nearby. And all he does is he sees molten steel contact snow and it violently erupts. Like laws of thermodynamics, you've got this heat, you got this energy exchange, and it's a violent eruption. This was apparently just enough in the mind of a romantic to create an entirely new cosmological paradigm in his own mind. All he had to do was see molten steel erupt in snow, and he thought he had figured out the origin of the universe. This is how quick to weird ideology and worldviews these Nazis, they didn't know how to diversify their thoughts. They were all in, all at one time. If it came to them, boom, we're going to trust it. We're going to feel our way through reality. We're not going to really necessarily test it. So, nevertheless, he believed that Earth's gravity had captured many moons. This is another thing. I don't know where he's coming up with this, but he absolutely wrote about it. He believed that Earth's gravity had captured many moons in the past, each one eventually colliding with us, creating massive calamitous events resulting in the Great Flood, the loss of Atlantis, and the twilight of the gods. Atlantis was a huge thing with these people. It was a huge thing. We'll talk about Ahnenerbe maybe in a minute. The Völkisch loved and supported the work of Hans Horberger as it further explained the existence of the giants who they believed still lived in Hollow Earth. They believed that the gravitational pull of some of these moons created 16-foot humans and enlarged the vegetation that we know once existed. Now, I think that when you look at the biblical, idea of the flood, there's a lot of evidence I almost said global flood. I'm sure that would have evoked a response. Sorry, it's my programming coming out. But we had a worldwide flood, right? And we all know it makes more sense inside of an enclosed dome model, right? A lot of people have looked at this in the Genesis account. I think that there was plenty of evidence that had happened, but they were reading this mythological worldview into it. And they did believe in a massive flood. I find that incredibly interesting. They believe it wiped out the race of giants. They just believe they came from the giants, and they believe, they had a version of cosmology that was vastly different and unsupported by facts. But there are these weird moments in their belief system, in our own biblical belief system, that leads me to believe that they were onto something. There was at least something there that they were looking at that was actually giving them some sort of accurate reflection as to reality, even if their conclusions, I believe, were ultimately flawed. At 65 years of age, Horbiger stood firmly against the world of secular astronomy and publicly issued a warning that objective science is a pernicious invention, and he considered it a totem of decadence. You'll find that the fascists aligned themselves not only against the Jews, but against what the Jews contributed to Western civilization. A transcendent God who reveals a transcendent moral law was anathema to the fascists. Such transcendence, they agreed, alienates human beings from nature and from themselves. Fascist intellectuals sought to form a new spirituality of immanence focused upon nature, human emotions, and the community. Essentially, fascism was a spiritual movement. It was a revolt against Judeo-Christian tradition. It was directly in contrast and opposition to the Bible. And while many differences exist between the National Socialist state of Nazi Germany, the appeals to continuity, animosity to the biblical message of God are as separate from creation and the energizing power of group emotion to shape social dynamics. Every ounce of this was used emotionally against an entire people group. You have to understand, there became this outcry for blood and soil. They were using the ethnic identity, the mythological history that they had studied. They were using this to tie themselves to the German people in a way that they were also energizing them through group emotion. It was a flurry of manipulative emotion. They had no care in the world if it was factual or not, but they were steering an entire country the direction they wanted to go based on how they felt, okay? I really don't see a lot of difference between that in our own society today, to be honest with you, in many respects, including the modern day church. They did not know how to take it slow. One imagination session led to one session from Hans led to the forceful reimagining and rewriting of an entire cosmological paradigm. One dream. And it wasn't even a sleeping dream. You have to understand where these people are coming from. He supposed ice to be the basic substance of all cosmic processes. Most impressively, materialized in the moon, the Milky Way, and the ether, apart from purporting to explain all astronomical, geological, and meteorological phenomena. The Wiltshire, which is the German word for cosmic ice theory, was also said to be the foundation of a new cosmic cultural history. The foundation of a new, forming both a scientific and philosophical, poetic and artistic, these are their words, man, cosmo-technical worldview that Horbiger called an astronomy of the invisible. Okay, and this was just critique on this. It was Cosmic Ice Theory, Science Fiction in the Public, written by Christina Wesley, 1894 to 1945. This is where the idea ultimately led to. All of that to say this. Either you will learn to believe in me, or you will be treated as an enemy. They were told to have prospective employees sign a statement reading, I believe in the theory of eternal ice. Ice. Right? You see at least maybe some of the questions that you can derive from that. I'm not 100% sure what exactly they're talking about. But they had this concept of cosmic ice and cosmic fire that went above and beyond anything I've ever seen before. They understood that the cosmological paradigm was vastly different than what was coming out of the West. I don't know what the reality was as far as the conclusions we can ultimately draw, but I can tell you what, I think they distrusted it, and I think they distrusted it with good reason. They actually spent a lot of time and a lot of money creating organizations to research this stuff. One of them was called Ahnenerbe. Joe, how's my time? 9 minutes? Your fingers look really small that far, so it's hard to read them. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler created a Nazi ancestral research organization that became responsible for researching occult theories, the ancestral origins of their Aryan history. This organization was responsible for suppressing any opposition to Horbigger's eternal ice theory, as well as carrying out expeditions to locate the remains of giants long lost in Europe and Asia. It was a Nazi research agency. That's what it was. It was like a weird supernatural CIA or something. I don't know. The teams that it produced and financed traveled to places like Tibet, Nordic lands. They were everywhere they went. They were searching for Nordic clues, ruins, deities, myths, cultural artifacts. Cultic artifacts. I know for a fact that a big portion of some of their time was spent at a place called Upside Down Mountain in France, which was today a modern-day UFO hotspot where people believe there's some sort of alien base in the mountain. The mountain itself doesn't really look upside down. It's just got a flat top. But there is a lot of folklore around that mountain. There was a lot of Nazi activity around that mountain in France. And I actually had a friend that traveled there in 2012, I think, because the media was reporting 130,000 people gathering outside of it expecting some sort of extraterrestrial event. And when he actually got there were like 4 people at a coffee shop and no one knew what he was talking about. So I'll never forget the major fail that was the American media, and I still don't know what that was about. But we were expecting something amazing at Upside Down Mountain, knowing the Nazi background there and some of the things they were looking for in relationship to Ahnenerbe. There was nothing there, but that doesn't mean there wasn't anything there at one time. I don't know, but that area was riddled with it. That was Ahnenerbe's job. Go out and find it. But the most incredible research of all was set up in 1939 in Berlin. An astrologer, William Huff, who was made prisoner of the SS and coerced into working for it. This goes back to controlling those who worked with the occult. This guy was considered to be an amazing occultist when it came to astrology. So he was utilized and placed in the staff. He described the Berlin Institute's Scientific Research Center as being used to harness not only natural but also supernatural forces, all intellectual, natural, and supernatural sources of power, from modern technology to medieval black magic, and from the teachings of Pythagoras to Faustian pentagrams, the Faustian pentagram incantation, and they were to be exploited in the interests of final victory. Heinrich Himmler, there's a lot on Heinrich Himmler. I can tell you this, for the sake of time, Heinrich Himmler had one of the largest Jesuit libraries that I think anybody's had. At least it's been documented. He was actually known as a man that would just sit there night after night after night. A lot of the organizations that he designed were actually based on Jesuit military structure. They hated the Jesuits. They hated any idea of the Masonic, the Jesuit. I mean, this was all a conspiracy to them, but they did consider them to be efficient models to be studied and utilized. So he was a big pursuer of some of the Jesuit ideology, which I do find interesting. Lebensborn. He was actually the brainchild behind Lebensborn, which tied back into the eugenics stuff. Himmler was the mastermind behind it. It was a chain of maternity homes encouraging illegitimate breeding out of wedlock in order to increase the members of pure blood Germans. Some SS officers were forced to join and support the program financially. He had ultimate hopes of breeding German supermen in order to assist in once again creating the ancient Germanic empire of Aryan myth and legend. He actually theorized that when conception took place in the womb, if conception in the womb took place in a Nordic cemetery, that the baby that was conceived would actually inherit the spirit of all the dead heroes that lay therein. Lists of such cemeteries were published regularly in the SS periodical Das Schwarzkorps. And okay, let me put it to you this way. They created maps of all the crazy cemeteries that had all the old people buried, and they told teenagers, go out there and have sex with as many of our fine troops as you possibly can and give us super babies. That's what happened. They created maternity homes to support it. It was financed by government taxation, a form of government taxation. A lot of the SS soldiers were actually forced into a tithe of sorts. But this is what they did. This is how much they believed in what we're talking about. And guys, to be honest, interesting to some, boring to others, let me tell you, there's a lot more where this came from. This is just some of the more interesting things that tend to be a little sensational and captivate attention. There was a lot more to this. There was a lot more to the SS. There was a lot more to Himmler. There were a lot more players in the game. Everybody in this nation was obsessed with this stuff on a level that you and I just can't comprehend. So this leads me here, okay? Pause for dramatic effect. Nazis not only exhibited a great deal of influence inside of NASA during the heyday of its formation up to the Apollo moon landings, but indeed that the Nazis exercised the greatest influence inside the organization, eventually co-opting or making common cause with two other significant hidden and esoteric influences in the space agency. You can find this all in Joseph P. Farrell's book, Nazi International. I loved that book. It was a good book. Over the course of years of research, Hoagland and Barra, I don't know if you guys have ever read this book, but over the course of years of research, Hoagland and Barra identified three groups, each with their own connections deep within the world of the occult and esoteric traditions. They each held significant positions of managerial power and influences within NASA. Masons, magicians, and Nazis, those were the three categories, but less well known were the other two occult groups, the Masons and the magicians. So you did have three factions there, a third of which were the Nazis. And as you can see, the Nazis were coming with a very distorted worldview. Each sect is led by prominent individuals and supported by lesser known players. Each has stamped their own agenda on our space program in indelible but traceable ways, and each remarkably is dominated by a secret or occult doctrine that is far more closely aligned with ancient religion and mysticism than it is with rational science and cool empiricism these men promote to the general public as NASA's overriding mantra. You'll notice, if you look at the emphasis the Nazis placed on mythology, right, this worldview, this brotherhood, these blood ties to the past, it's their blood ties, ultimately, they believe, that led to this sort of purpose with giving birth to a new reality. You're trying to create a new world that was largely based on these mythological beliefs. And I find it interesting that absolutely everything that NASA did and named went back to the same system of mythology. You know? You look at everything they named, it was Greek mythology from its inception. I've got a whole list of names here. You can get on the internet and find you had, depending on what you're looking at, you had launch vehicles and boosters and different stages and different versions, and there are a million different projects at NASA. But here's just some of the names of these things. Thor Delta, Atlas Centaur, then you had Saturn IV, Saturn V, you had the Titan Centaur. In a 2015 Smithsonian Magazine article, the headline was, Keeping you current from Project Mercury to Space Shuttle Atlantis. You know? The Nazis were obsessed with Atlantis. You see the same obsession in NASA with their projects and naming these things. I don't know exactly what to do with that. I just find it interesting food for thought. NASA actually held a vote to pick a theme in naming new formations on Pluto not too long ago, several years. The new theme was voted to be Afterlife in the Underworld. This actually led to names like I don't know how to pronounce this, Mang Po. It was a Buddhist underworld goddess who helped reincarnated souls forget their past, right? Back to Eastern mysticism. You had Thule. We're naming formations on Pluto, Thule. H.P. Lovecraft, horror writing, Romanticism. This is the horror writing that I talked about that came out of the 1800s. Balrog. They even named stuff after Lord of the Rings. They were obsessed with it. This book that Richard C. Hoagland wrote, I know there are a lot of conflicting opinions about him, but I do think that this quote is very accurate. We are uniformly, unabashedly conspiracy theorists and have against our wills become truly convinced that there has been a conscious, carefully planned, and permanent cover-up by NASA of some of its most extraordinary discoveries made in the course of the agency's 44-year history. All of this, of course, implies that there was a secret agenda to the early space race, one having nothing whatsoever with beating the Soviet Union to the moon. I will just leave you with this. I'm not telling you to draw any specific conclusion. But in regards to this quote, there is plenty of evidence that NASA forever has been up to something else other than what they're telling us. The question is, what is it? And I see a lot of connections to some of the old Nazi ideology and some of their own special projects. They give me pause for thought. And I just have to ask myself, since a significant portion of NASA largely comes from this people group and this worldview, I don't know exactly what we can derive from it, but I think it's worth asking questions. And if you ask these kinds of questions, you're certainly not crazy for doing so, because history allows you to. These people were weird. They were completely insane in their own their own concepts, but not so insane that they weren't perceptive to at least some aspects of reality. And I'm a firm believer in Romans 1 that everything that can be made known about God has been made plain in creation. And that's one of the reasons why, even though I don't have all the answers, it's absolutely acceptable to question the nature of the world that we live in, because it testifies at least something about the God that made us. Natural theology is important, and even though you can never study natural theology and come to a knowledge of God by special revelation, it certainly does provide lots of interesting theological clues about where we come from and who's in control. And that's been made clear in Romans 1. And I think that over the course of years in history, we've seen people groups that have sought the same answers, and I think that I think there's good reason to question the paradigm that's come out of the West and pretty much won the popular opinion. You guys aren't crazy for asking these questions, and neither am I. And I'm privileged to be in a group of you, all you weirdos just like me, hanging out, talking about Nazis at 9 o'clock in California. Thanks, guys. Thanks for spending time with me.